The worn soles of my shoes clicked softly against the floor with every step, as I clutched the cheap cocktail like a lifeline. The dim green lights cast shadows over unfamiliar faces, turning people into ghosts and memories into nightmares. The ice cubes clinked against the plastic glass, a poor substitute for crystal, much like me. A lesser version of the woman I once was. 3 months after the divorce, I still couldn't shake the emptiness that hollowed me out, stripping away everything that used to make me feel like myself. That was when I saw him. Mark Bennett, my ex-husband, leaning casually against the bar with his new girlfriend. She was tall, with voluminous blonde hair and a tight red dress that seemed to belong on the glossy pages of a fashion magazine. Her smile gleamed under the neon lights. Screaming silently at me, he chose me. And Mark God. He looked as if the word pain had never existed in his vocabulary. Immaculate. Composed. The way his hand rested on her back, the same place where it used to rest on mine, made my throat tighten. Memories rushed back like a winter gust cold. Biting. And uninvited. The final argument. The contempt in his eyes. The cruel words, "You're not attractive anymore," slammed into me just as hard as the door he closed that night. It had taken me weeks to piece myself back together, to stitch up the remnants of who I was, only to find him here tonight, in what I thought was my safe place. I stood still in the shadows, trembling slightly, my drink about to spill. The waitress shrugged as she passed me, probably thinking I was drunk. I wished I was. I wished I couldn't feel the frantic thud of my heartbeat, the short, trembling breaths that felt like sobs waiting to escape. But I stayed there, frozen, like a lost soul adrift in her own life. Then, a voice broke through the heavy music beside me, low, warm, tinged with a faint foreign accent, cutting through the noise like a blade. "You look like you're about to cry, or kill someone." I turned, blinking rapidly to keep a tear from falling. The man beside me didn't belong in a place like this. It wasn't just that he was tall. He stood a full head above me, but there was something about him, an aura of quiet power, composure, and authority that made people hesitate to approach. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a black shirt with no tie, the collar slightly undone, not flashy, but unmistakably expensive. His scent was a mix of sandalwood, leather, and the faint trace of Cuban cigar smoke. I heard myself answering, my voice rough but steady. "No, I just should have picked another bar." He followed my gaze and stopped when he found Mark and the woman. For a brief moment, a flicker of coldness crossed his eyes there and gone, like it had never been. "Ex-husband?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. I nodded, suddenly feeling pathetic standing here in the dark, clutching a watered-down drink, staring at the past like a fool. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "Would you dance with me? He's watching." I paused, heat rushing to my face. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I don't even know who you are." The corner of his mouth lifted not quite a smile, but something between challenge and kindness. "You don't," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over me. Not lustful, but observant, as if memorizing the details. But I know his kind. He extended his hand. Long fingers, neatly trimmed nails, a silver watch peeking from under his cuff. The palm was calloused unexpected for a man who looked like a businessman. "Just one dance," he said softly. "Make him regret letting you go." He hesitated. Instinct told me to walk away, but desperation drowned out reason. At that moment, Mark laughed loudly, the sound echoing through me like a slap. The blonde leaned her head against his shoulder. Giggling, I placed my hand in the stranger's. His grip was firm, guiding, his other hand resting lightly on my back. The touch was gentle, yet carried a quiet control, not forceful, just leading. As we moved toward the dance floor, I caught Mark's eyes. He was watching, and this time it was me he couldn't look away from. The music shifted into a slow, soulful rhythm. The bar lights softened, and we began to dance. Jack didn't need to ask whether I knew the steps. He simply led, every movement fluid, as if he had been born to guide another's motion. His hand rested lightly on my back, firm enough to steady me, gentle enough to make me feel no longer lost. The sense of safety came too quickly, too strangely, and too dangerously. I could feel my heartbeat sinking with his steps. No longer the frantic rhythm of a woman watching her ex-husband with someone new, but a different pulse, stronger, alive, as if I'd been reborn right there on that dance floor. Jack's gaze never wavered. It wasn't the hungry look of drunk men around us. It was something quieter. Deeper, he looked at me as if I were a question waiting to be answered. A melody yearning for harmony. Perhaps he saw something in my eyes I had forgotten existed, the trace of who I used to be. When his arm tightened just slightly around me, I noticed Mark still watching. His stare clung to me, to Jack, to the way I tilted my head and smiled at this stranger who suddenly felt familiar. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like the loser. I spun beneath Jack's lead, my hair lifting, my dress brushing my thighs, and I heard it, my own laughter. Not the hollow laugh I faked at work, not the brittle sound that echoed off my kitchen walls, but real laughter, full, breathy, alive, as if someone had flung open a door long locked inside me. Jack leaned closer, just enough for me to catch the scent of his cologne, mingled with something raw and earthy, like burning wood. His voice brushed my ear, low and steady, like a late-night whisper. "He's losing his mind over you." A shiver ran through me, not from his words, but from how he said them. There was no mockery, no smugness, just calm certainty, as though he understood the power of this moment and was offering it to me freely. I looked up, and for the first time, noticed his eyes. Not blue, not brown, but a steel gray like a frozen lake in winter. Still on the surface, but swirling beneath. Those eyes had seen things more than I could imagine. He wasn't the kind of man who came to bars looking for company. He didn't need to look. He chose. And tonight, he chose me. When the song ended, Jack didn't let go. A brief silence filled the space between songs, the kind that feels like a pause before a choice. I could walk away, thank him, return to my melting drink in the corner. Or I could let myself drift with this feeling, like a boat leaving shore after years of being anchored. I said nothing, but my hand remained in his. Jack led me off the dance floor, right past Mark. I didn't look back, but I could feel Mark's eyes following every step we took. When we reached a table tucked in the corner, Jack pulled out a chair for me as if we were in a fine restaurant, not a bar that smelled faintly of old beer and dust. He sat across from me, his back straight, the light carving quiet shadows along his face, still silent, still watching. His silence didn't make me uneasy. It made me feel seen. Not for my body or my face, but for something deeper. I felt my breathing settle. Jack lifted his hand slightly toward the bartender. No words. Yet they understood. A glass of bourbon appeared before him. A glass of white wine before me. "How did you know I drink white?" I asked, half teasing. Jack's lips curved faintly, but he didn't answer. "Some people can read you just by the way you sit, by the tremor in your hand, by the faded imprint of a ring once worn." And I realized I was sitting across from a man like that. A man who didn't ask too many questions, because he already knew too much. And for the first time in months, I didn't want to look away. Jack lifted his glass of bourbon, quietly observing me through the soft haze of bar lights. He didn't ask me anything. I didn't rush to fill the silence with meaningless small talk. The quiet between us didn't feel awkward. Instead, it felt like a thin blanket laid gently over the storm, still stirring inside me. I brought the glass of white wine to my lips. The cool, tart taste, soothing my throat, as if I had just swallowed a mouthful of courage. I didn't know what I was doing, why I was sitting here with a man I'd only just met, or why I felt light. For the first time in months, Jack leaned back slightly in his chair, his head tilted to one side. I could sense his gaze steady, perceptive, not only on me but on the space around us. I knew this type of man, the kind who never let themselves be caught off guard. Then, from the bar, I saw Mark start moving toward us. His face had lost the relaxed ease it wore earlier. The blonde woman still sat at the counter, turning to look for him, confusion written across her face. Jack glanced in their direction, his expression unchanged, though his fingers tightened subtly around the bourbon glass. Mark stopped a few steps away, his eyes clouded with the kind of anger that has nowhere to go. "Claire," he said, voice low, trying to sound composed. I smiled faintly, willing my hands not to tremble. Mark looked at Jack, then back at me. "Who's this?" A new friend. Jack said nothing. He simply tilted his head toward me, as if granting me the floor. I looked at Mark for a long time, really looked at him. Maybe for the first time since everything had fallen apart. "This is Jack," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "A man who knows how to value what you lost." The words made Mark flinch. His jaw tightened, the muscle along his neck pulsed. Jack rose to his feet without a word. Yet somehow, the air around him thickened. Taut like a string pulled tight, he rested a hand lightly on my back, his gaze never leaving Mark's. There was no threat in his eyes, no hostility, just an unshakable presence that couldn't be ignored. We left the table, and Jack guided me back to the dance floor, just as the next song began, a slow, sultry jazz tune that hummed with quiet tension. I didn't look back, but I could feel Mark's eyes on me, sharp as a blade. He was watching, stunned, as the woman who once begged for his love now moved effortlessly in another man's arms. Jack drew me a little closer, close enough for me to feel the rhythm of his calm, even breaths, the warm trace of sandalwood that clung to his shirt. My hand rested on his shoulder, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't trembling anymore. I was standing tall, head high, eyes forward. I wasn't hiding. I was being seen, truly seen. Jack smiled faintly. "You know," he murmured, "he never thought he'd see you like this." I laughed, nodded his words. But because I knew he was right, Mark had never believed I could find myself again, that I could stand radiant and unbroken in the arms of someone else. And in that moment, I understood Jack hadn't just made Mark jealous. He had reminded me of who I was, a woman who could love, who could let go, who could rise from the wreckage. The song began to slow, the final notes fading like an exhale. But I didn't want to leave his arms, not because of Jack, but because of me, the woman I was beginning to remember. And when the music finally stopped, I told myself that maybe I wasn't ready for love again, but at least I was ready to hold my head high and keep walking, without ever bowing to anyone again. We returned to the same table after the dance. Neither of us spoke for several seconds, as if we had silently agreed to protect that fragile, quiet safe, yet thrumming with unspoken energy. I took a sip of my white wine. The glass was half empty now, and the chill lingering on its rim numbed the tips of my fingers. Jack sat as before, his back straight, his gaze steady, not invasive, but so intent it felt as though he were reading me page by page, a book incapable of hiding its truth. There was something about him polished, restrained, but also dangerous in the way one never fully relaxes around beauty that could break. It felt like walking on thin ice, breathtaking but fragile, where every step required care. I decided to break the silence first. "What do you do for a living?" "Jack." My voice sounded soft, unguarded, not probing, just a woman's curiosity toward the man who had somehow reminded her of who she used to be. He set his bourbon down, his eyes still fixed on me. "I run a network of logistics and transport companies." His tone dropped slightly on the last word, quiet, intimate, like something whispered in the dark, rather than spoken in a bar. "Transport?" I raised an eyebrow. "Like trucks and deliveries." He smiled faintly, amused. "Close, just on a larger scale. International, multiple destinations, multiple kinds of cargo." He paused, then added, "And many things to keep under control." I nodded. "That suits you, control." The way he held a gaze, the way he moved, as if no one could stand in his path. It wasn't arrogance, it was a kind of silent power, the kind that hummed beneath the surface, like a storm not yet risen, but certain to destroy once it did. Leaning forward, my elbows resting on the table. I asked, "Do you always choose the corner seat?" He glanced around before answering. "I like to observe, and the corner's the only place where no one can stand behind me." The reply was almost casual, yet it sent a quiet shiver through me. Most men never think about who stands behind them, unless they've lived in a world where turning your back once meant danger. I straightened in my seat, a flicker of instinct stirring in the back of my mind. I wasn't afraid. But I began to realize Jack was not just a wealthy man, or a well-dressed stranger who happened to appear the moment I needed someone to help me stand again. He was a man who read the air, who chose his words with precision, who never wasted breath on the unnecessary. Jack tapped the rim of my glass lightly, a silent cue to take another sip. I smiled, then asked, half teasing, half serious, "So, do you often rescue women trying to drive their ex-husbands insane?" Like tonight, he didn't laugh. He only looked at me a little longer. "No, but I recognize when a woman needs to remember how strong she once was. And I think you forgot that." I froze slightly. Anyone else saying that might have sounded condescending. But from him, it felt different, like someone pressing a hand over a bruise. Not to hurt, but to warm it back to life. His eyes softened, though his tone stayed steady. "Why did you let him hurt you that much?" I let out a brittle laugh. "Because I thought love meant enduring. Because I thought I had to hold the family together for my child. Because I thought I didn't deserve anything better." He nodded slowly, thoughtfully. After a pause, he asked, "And now?" "Now," I said, glancing at him over the rim of my glass. "I'm sitting in a cheap bar with a man I barely know, after making my ex-husband furious, and I think I'm starting to believe I deserve more." This time, Jack really smiled, not at me, but at the words themselves, as if pleased with their existence. "You're starting to remember," he said quietly, leaning back, his eyes never leaving mine. And in that moment, I knew I had just stepped into a conversation whose ending might alter the entire course of my life, and part of me, deep down, didn't want it to end. I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there, across from Jack, the music changing from one song to another, yet none of it really reaching me. It felt as if every sound around us had been pushed to the edges, leaving just enough space for two people and a handful of words that touched, one by one, the shell I'd built around myself for years. Jack didn't speak much, but every sentence he offered lingered long after. Not because it was strange, but because it was true, the kind of truth people avoid admitting, even when it's too sharp to deny. When I finally glanced at the clock, the hands had already slipped past midnight. My stomach felt faintly hollow, my head light. I reached for my purse, shifting slightly in my seat, a small signal that it was time to leave. Jack didn't try to stop me, didn't stand too quickly. He only nodded, as if he'd known this moment was inevitable. "Thank you for the dance," I said, and the conversation. I was standing but hadn't yet taken a step. His voice was steady, low, the same as it had been all night. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I just reminded you that you're still here." My heart tightened, the words landing like a soft hook sinking into my mind, something I knew I'd carry with me out into the night. Jack didn't offer to walk me home. He didn't ask for my number. He simply rose, pulled out my chair again, a quiet farewell, made not with words, but with the kind of grace that leaves an echo. I stepped outside. The air was cool, a thin breeze slipping beneath my coat. No car waited at the curb. I opened the ride app, hesitated. Through the wide glass window of the bar, I could still see Jack. He was sitting alone, bourbonnenhant, not looking out. Yet somehow I felt he knew I was there. A strange feeling stirred in me, not longing, not desire. Exactly. More like that moment when you leave a room but the light inside remains on, and you know that if you turned back, everything would still be there, waiting. I began to worry for my own clarity. Part of me wanted to walk back in, to ask something foolish like, "Do you come here often?" or "Are you free tomorrow?" But I knew that if I did, I would ruin something delicate. Because Jack wasn't the kind of man you asked ordinary questions. And this night wasn't made for the predictable. The car arrived. I slid into the back seat. Silent. Watching the city blur past the window. Each streetlight flashed by like a fleeting thought. And I couldn't help thinking about Jack, not just his face or the way he seemed to quiet a room simply by existing, but the feeling I had when I was with him, for the first time in years. I felt seen not as the woman left behind, but as someone with so much more still waiting to surface. When I reached home, I unlocked the door to my empty apartment. The click of the key sounded loud against the stillness. The kitchen light glowed dimly, just as it always did when I went out. I set my purse on the counter, slipped off my shoes, hung my coat, everything in its usual rhythm, but my mind hadn't returned with me. It was still back in that dim old bar, on that dance floor, beneath the gaze of my furious ex-husband, and beside a stranger who had somehow reminded me that I was alive. I sat on the edge of my bed and turned on my phone. The screen was empty. No messages. No missed calls. A quiet disappointment flickered through me, though I knew I had no reason to expect otherwise. There had been no promises. No exchanged numbers. It was only one night. One single night. And yet, no matter how many times I told myself it was fleeting, I couldn't shake the truth that it had touched something deep within me. And I knew, no matter how hard I tried to move past it. His name. Those steel gray eyes. That silence heavy with meaning, they would stay with me far longer than I intended. I woke the next morning with the strange, weightless feeling that the night before had been nothing more than a dream. But the strap marks across my shoulder and the pair of shoes abandoned in the middle of the floor were undeniable proof that it had really happened. I had danced with a stranger, met Mark's eyes without bowing my head, and laughed, truly laughed after months of swallowing tears in silence. I had just finished making coffee when a text came in from the hospital's front desk. I was on the morning shift, due before 7. The message was short. There's something waiting for you in the administrative office. I frowned. Deliveries to the hospital were usually paperwork or items from patients' families, but when I walked into the room, I froze. On the counter sat a tall glass vase filled with white roses, delicately arranged with pale lavender sprigs and tiny baby's breath blooms. Next to it was a sleek black paper bag containing 2 butter croissants, a glass bottle of apple juice, and a small container of yogurt with granola, the same kind I always bought from the cafe near my apartment. No one said a word, but the glances from the nurses nearby were enough to make me blush. Deb, my colleague and best friend for over 10 years, entered just as I picked up the small card, tucked into the bouquet. The handwriting was clean and confident. Only one line, a morning gentle enough to remind you last night was real. Below it was a single letter, J. Deb glanced from me to the flowers, one eyebrow lifting in silent question. I slipped the card into the pocket of my white coat, pretending to be calm as I stepped out of the room. But all morning, I couldn't focus. I misplaced the blood pressure cuff while examining a patient, entered the wrong pharmaceutical code into the system. By 10, Deb pulled me into the break room, shut the door, and crossed her arms like an impatient older sister. All right. Spill it. Who sent the flowers, not Mark? Right. I sank into the chair and exhaled. Jack, I said softly, just loud enough for her to hear. Jack, who I hesitated, then told her everything from the bar. The dance, the look on Mark's face, to the way Jack made me feel like a woman who mattered. Deb listened without interrupting, only nodding now and then. When I told her he hadn't asked for my number, hadn't suggested seeing me again, she frowned. And this morning, flowers show up. You mean he knew where you work? I blinked. Right. I had never told him. I hadn't been in uniform last night either. A chill crept down my spine. I forced a small laugh to brush it off. Maybe he asked at the bar, or followed me home, or maybe I said it and forgot. Deb didn't laugh. Her hand went to her hip, her tone firm. Claire, I don't want to kill the magic, but a man who can send exactly what you like for breakfast. Choose the flowers you love, and find your workplace all within 12 hours is not an ordinary man. He swallowed hard, Part of me knew she was right, but another part, the part beating wildly in my chest, wasn't afraid. He felt seen, noticed, remembered in detail. After years in a marriage where I had become invisible, someone had remembered that I drink white wine, ate butter croissant, and love lavender. It made me feel alive again. Diab Syed, sitting beside me. Just be careful. Okay, men who make women feel special too fast often have sides you can't see yet. I nodded, squeezing her hand. I know, but right now, I just want to let myself enjoy it, to feel like a woman someone chose to notice, even if it's just once. And I didn't know then that that once would be the moment I could never turn back from. I ended my morning shift exhausted, my body heavy but my mind strangely alert, all through the day. I couldn't stop thinking about the bouquet that had appeared that morning, the single line written in firm handwriting, the letter J beneath it. It lingered in my mind like a soft, haunting note, refusing to fade. I caught myself wondering what he was doing at that very moment, whether he was thinking of me, sitting somewhere with a glass of bourbon like the night before, or already back in a world I didn't belong to. I was just stepping out of the hospital when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Seeing the name on the screen made my heart stumble. Mark. His name still appeared unchanged. Though I had thought about renaming it, Don't Answer or Ignore, I hesitated a second before picking up. Claire, he snapped, without so much as a greeting, his tone sharp, cold, as though I had committed some terrible offense. Do you even know what you're doing the other night? In front of my friends. You dragged some stranger onto the dance floor like you were trying to make a fool of yourself. I gripped the strap of my bag tighter, forcing my voice to stay calm. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just living my life. He let out a short, bitter laugh. Living your life with what my alimony, Claire? You're playing with fire. I know you still have the money from selling the house. If you don't want trouble from my lawyer, you'd better return it. My fingers went numb around the phone. Mark had always been able to make me cry with just a few words, and maybe a part of me still remembered that fear. But now, standing in the hospital parking lot with the wind cutting across my face and the late sunlight brushing my shoulder, I knew I was no longer the woman who once begged for his attention. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. That money is mine. It's in the divorce agreement. You have no right to ask for it. Silence filled the line for a few seconds. Then his voice dropped. Lower. Quieter but sharper. Like a knife drawn through fabric. Don't make me find another way. You know I can. The sentence pierced the air, no shouting. No insults. But heavy enough to remind me that Mark never gave up easily. I hung up without another word, my hands trembling inside my coat pocket. Sitting in the car, I fastened my seatbelt and stayed there, staring blankly through the windshield. Deb's words from the morning echoed in my mind, her warning that sometimes the men who notice every detail are the ones hiding the darkest corners. But what about Mark? I knew his darkness. I had lived in it. It had taken me years to claw my way out. And now, just as I had begun to feel a sliver of light again, he wanted to pull me back in. That night, I didn't turn on the kitchen light like I usually did. I sat in the dark, my phone on the table like a small, loaded weapon. I didn't know who Jack really was, or how he knew I loved lavender and French breakfasts. But I did know this when I stood next to Jack. I didn't feel afraid. Mark, the man who had once shared my bed, my memories, my youth, just one call from him was enough to make my chest tighten, my breath falter. I wondered, if Jack knew about this, what he would say. Part of me wanted to tell him, to hear someone understand without judging, but I had no number, no message, no promise, only a single letter J and one unforgettable night. And as I sat there in the dim kitchen, I realized the past had never truly left. It had only been waiting for the right moment to knock again, this time wearing a face far more dangerous. Yet I also understood something else. I was no longer the old Claire. And this time, I would not let anyone, especially fear, decide my life for me. 2 days after that phone call, I still hadn't managed to calm down. Outwardly, I acted as though everything was normal, went to work, smiled at Patience, shared coffee with Deb during our break, but inside, I was wound tight, like a string ready to snap. I kept trying to shake off Mark's shadow, to tell myself he was only playing his old games, that I was no longer his puppet. But the harder I tried to appear fine, the more I realized I was waiting for something. A reaction. A call. Some sign that I wasn't alone. And then it came, just not in the way I expected. I was leaving the hospital late that evening when I saw Mark leaning against his familiar car by the curb. The streetlight slanted across his face, highlighting the crease in his brow, the set of his jaw, and I knew instantly this wasn't a casual encounter. I stopped, my palms slick with sweat despite the chill in the air. "Claire, we need to talk." His voice was clipped, stripped of any restraint. "I have nothing to say to you." I moved to walk around him, pretending not to notice. But Mark grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it made me wince. "Let go," I said firmly, trying to keep my tone steady. He leaned closer, his breath sharp with alcohol. "You really think one dance with some stranger means you're free of me? You owe me. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." I yanked my arm away and took a step back. But he followed. Everything happened too fast. I didn't even have time to think about running inside before a voice broke through the night low. Steady, and so controlled that it froze the air around us. "I believe she asked you to let go." Mark turned, and I saw Jack emerging from the darkness across the street. He didn't run. He didn't charge forward like in the movies. He walked slow, deliberate, each step carrying a quiet authority that made the pavement seem to echo beneath him. The streetlight didn't fully catch his face, but his steel-gray eyes glinted through the dimness like cold fire. Mark released me, as if shocked, but stayed where he was, still blocking the space between us. "Who the hell are you? This isn't your business." Jack stopped a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his long black coat, his head tilted slightly, his voice calm but unyielding. "I'm the only person here who doesn't need to shout to prove he has control. Step back." Mark scoffed, but the sound died quickly when Jack took one more step forward, close enough for the tension to hum in the air. There was something in the way he stood, an ease that came not from size or strength, but from experience, from a stillness that only men who have faced danger and survived it could carry. I stood frozen, heart pounding, watching the two men, one from my past, one I barely knew, face each other. But in that moment, I understood something that frightened me more than anything else. Jack wasn't just the man who made me feel worthy again. He was the kind of man who could make Mark, who had manipulated me for years, take a step back with nothing more than a look. Mark muttered something under his breath, then turned away, tossing out one last warning as he left. "Don't think this is over. I'll be back." I had never been as afraid of Mark as I was right then, not because he yelled, but because he walked away in silence, and I knew the storm wasn't over. Jack looked at me, not touching, not asking questions. He just stood there steady, grounded, unjudging. I was shaking, from the cold and from the adrenaline still rushing through me. Jack reached into his coat and pulled out a thin scarf, draping it gently over my shoulders. Then he guided me toward his car, opening the passenger door for me. I didn't speak. I just sat down quietly. When he circled around and got into the driver's seat, I turned to him. "How long were you there since he arrived?" He said simply. I didn't ask anything more. I didn't need to know why he came. All I knew was that if Jack hadn't appeared tonight, I might have slipped back into the terrified woman I used to be. And now, sitting in the warm hush of his car, I understood something deeper than gratitude. I didn't just thank Jack anymore. I had begun to trust him. I couldn't sleep that night, even though I was home safe. Even though Jack had walked me all the way to my door and said nothing, except a quiet reminder to lock it well. I lay awake in the familiar dark, my heart refusing to settle. The image of Mark outside the hospital, his hand clamped around my wrist, the smell of alcohol on his breath, the fury in his eyes stayed vivid in my mind. But what lingered even more was Jack, stepping out from the shadows as if he had always been there, waiting for the right moment to appear. And that was what unsettled me most. He had known where to find me. What time my shift ended. When I would need help the most. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. The feeling of safety had been too strong. But the next morning, under a gray sky outside my window, the questions began to surface. How did he know I went to work as usual? Trying to focus, but my eyes kept drifting toward the third-floor window where I usually took breaks. Looking down at the parking lot, I noticed a black SUV idling a short distance from the hospital. Its engine running. It could have been anyone waiting for a patient. But I saw it again at noon. Same spot. Still running. And by the end of my shift, when I went to my car, it was still there. A chill crept along my spine. As I opened my door, I glanced sideways and caught the gaze of the man behind the wheel. He wore dark sunglasses. He didn't smile. Didn't move. But the way he watched me unflinching, unblinking, like someone on duty, sent goosebumps crawling across my arms. I drove home without turning on the radio, my mind racing through possibilities. Had Mark sent someone to follow me, or was it someone else? And deep down, a part of me whispered that if anyone had the means to know my every move, it was Jack. I had no number for him, no way to reach him. I didn't even know his last name, only that his name was Jack, that he drank bourbon, wore a long black coat, and had eyes cold enough to make Mark back down. When I got home, I stayed in the car for several minutes, torn between reason and impulse. Then I made up my mind. I started the engine again and drove straight to the bar where it had all begun. The place looked the same: dim lights, soft music, that lingering hum of lives passing through. I sat at the same seat, ordered the same cocktail, and asked the bartender, "Do you know a man named Jack Tall? Dark hair. Usually sits in the corner." The bartender studied me for a moment, then nodded. He reached beneath the counter and placed a small card in front of me. It was black, embossed with a lion's head, and a single phone number. No name, no address. I stared at it for a long while before taking out my phone and dialing the number. 3 rings, then a familiar voice, low, composed, unmistakable. "I didn't think you'd call." I paused. "You knew where I was. When my shift ended, you knew Mark came to find me. Did you send someone to follow me, Jack?" Didn't hesitate. "Yes." I stayed silent for a moment, caught between fear and an inexplicable sense of relief. "Why?" "Because I know Mark won't let go easily," he said, "and I'm not about to give him the chance." I drew in a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the phone. "Do you do this with everyone?" "No," he said simply. "Only with those I care about." I looked around the bar. No one was paying attention to me. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, but inside, something had shifted. I should have felt afraid. I should have been angry. Yet, strangely, I felt safer than I had in years. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to protect myself. Someone else was doing it for me quietly, completely. And though I still didn't fully understand who Jack was, I knew this much. I had just stepped one step further into a world that, once entered, offered no way back. Friday night arrived after a week of tense phone calls. The black SUV appearing again and again around the hospital, and endless thoughts of Jack that refused to quiet. That evening, a message arrived from an unknown number, though I knew exactly who it was. "If you need a place to breathe, let me take you out of the city tonight." Beneath the words was a single pin on a map, the shore of Lake Michigan, somewhere north of the city. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I simply stared at the message for a long time, and somehow, an hour later, I was driving down an almost empty highway, heading toward a faint scatter of lights beneath the darkening sky. I didn't understand what was pulling me there. Maybe curiosity, maybe exhaustion from always looking over my shoulder for Mark, or maybe that quiet, inexplicable sense of safety that came whenever I thought of Jack. By the time I arrived, the sky had turned deep, indigo, the surface of the lake reflecting the warm glow of a solitary villa nestled among tall pines. It wasn't grand in the way that flaunted wealth. It was elegant, restrained, pale gray stone walls, high glass doors, the golden light inside spilling gently across the water like an invitation. Jack stood waiting on the steps, sleeves rolled up, dark trousers, a glass of wine in his hand. No bodyguards, no staff, just him calm, composed, his steel-gray eyes watching me as if he'd known all along that I would come. I climbed the steps slowly, car keys still clutched in my hand. He said nothing, simply opened the door and gestured for me to enter. Inside, the room was warm and quiet. A stone fireplace glowed softly, the air rich with the scent of pine wood and leather. I set my bag on a chair and turned toward him. Why here? He walked to the window, looking out at the lake. Because it's the only place I can be myself. I didn't know how to respond. The stillness between us was unsettling, and yet I didn't want to break it. He poured 2 glasses of red wine and handed one to me. Not bourbon, I said, half teasing. He smiled faintly. Bourbon doesn't suit you. I sat on the sofa, the glass trembling slightly in my hand, not from cold, but from the shrinking distance between us. It wasn't filled with polite words or sidelong glances anymore. It was presence quiet, undeniable, charged. Jack sat beside me, not too close, but close enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from him. The fire crackled softly, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. He tilted his head, studying me. Claire, he said slowly, I didn't ask you here out of pity or to hide from Mark. I asked you because I wanted you here. Right now. In this place. I swallowed, unsure if it was his words or his eyes that left me breathless. There was nothing rushed or demanding in his voice, just truth. Steady and weighty. I set my glass down and stood, walking to the window. The lake outside was still as glass, the moon fractured into ripples by the faint wind. Jack came to stand behind me, not touching, only close enough that I could feel his presence like a warm blanket wrapped around the chaos still stirring inside me. When I turned, our eyes met. No questions, no hesitation. We both knew what this moment was. He lifted his hand, brushed his fingers lightly against my cheek, slow, patient, as if asking permission through touch alone. And I didn't pull away. When his lips met mine, every noise inside my head vanished. There was no Mark, no SUV, no sleepless nights or threatening calls. There was only me, Jack, and the simple, overwhelming truth that for the first time in years I wasn't merely surviving, I was alive. The next morning, I woke to soft sunlight spilling through the linen curtains, painting the room in a pale golden hue. For a moment, it felt as though I had wandered into another reality, one where time moved slower, and fear had no place. Jack wasn't beside me, but his warmth lingered on the sheets. His scent, a faint trace of wood smoke and bourbon, still hung in the air, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders. I followed the smell of coffee to the open kitchen overlooking the lake. Jack stood with his back to me, brewing coffee by hand. Not with a machine, each movement deliberate. Precise. Almost ceremonial. I sat on one of the high stools by the counter, cradling the warm porcelain cup he handed me. My heart caught somewhere between calm and chaos, because once the gentle silence settled, once the sweetness of the night began to fade, the questions I had been avoiding came back to knock. I didn't know where I was. Not exactly. I didn't know who Jack truly was. All I knew was that whenever I needed him, he appeared, but no one could show up that perfectly, that consistently, without leaving some kind of trace. I turned the cup slowly in my hands, then lifted my gaze to him. Can I ask you something? Jack nodded, eyes steady on me. I don't want to ruin anything, I said quietly. I just need to know who you really are. He didn't answer at once. Instead, he walked to the glass doors, staring out at the lake as if weighing the line between what could be said and what should remain unspoken. When he turned back, his eyes had changed, no longer soft, but shadowed, heavy, as though he'd been waiting for this question for a long time. Claire, he began, I'm not a simple man. The world I live in isn't the same as yours. I'm not a criminal, but I'm not innocent either. I live in the gray, where the law isn't always the final line, and morality bends with circumstance. My heart skipped a beat. The gray I asked softly, "What does that mean?" "Exactly." He stepped closer. His voice calm but deep. "I run an organization. We solve problems the system can't. Sometimes in ways people wouldn't call legal." He paused, meeting my eyes, but never at the expense of women, children, or anyone who can't defend themselves. "You have to believe that." I didn't look away. My mind began stitching together the fragments I'd collected, the way he observed everything without appearing to, the quiet control in his movements, how he always knew where I was without asking, and the chilling stillness that had made Mark back down without a word. "Should I be afraid of you?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. I wasn't retreating. I just needed to know. Jack rested his hand lightly on the counter, not touching me. "Just close. If you're someone I need to protect," he said, "then never. But if you're someone who would hurt others under my protection, then I can't promise anything." I nodded slowly. There was no persuasion in his tone. No attempt to soften the truth. Just honesty, cold, clean, and unmistakable. I turned back toward the lake, its ripples trembling under the morning light, reflecting the turmoil inside me. "I don't know what I'll think tomorrow, or next week," I said softly. "But right now, I know I don't want to leave, and I don't want to leave you." He didn't smile, but his eyes gentled. He nodded once, then refilled my cup with quiet care. In that moment, I understood I had stepped into a part of life where right and wrong no longer lived in neat, separate corners. But one thing I knew with absolute certainty after years confined by the cold logic of a loveless marriage. I had finally chosen feeling, and I had chosen Jack. Deb looked at me with a mix of curiosity and tension when I walked into the break room the next morning. 2 cups of hot coffee sat on the table, one exactly how I liked it. Black Americano with no sugar, and a phone lay face up, its screen frozen on a search result. I hadn't even sat down when she spoke, her voice cutting straight through the air. "Claire, we need to talk." I froze for a second, then took the seat across from her. I knew that look, the look of a friend who had waited patiently for too long and had finally run out of patience. I had no intention of lying to her, but I wasn't ready to tell the whole truth either. Deb leaned forward and slid the phone toward me. "Do you even know who he really is?" I looked down. The headline on a local news site read, "Jack L. Moretti, the controversial businessman behind a web of lakefront deals." The photo beside it was unmistakable. Jack, in a dark suit, stepping out of a building with 2 men following close behind. His gaze in the picture was sharper, colder, distant, but still the same one I'd seen in person. The same gaze that had made Mark step back. I exhaled slowly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. I know part of it. He hasn't hidden anything, but he doesn't exactly put it on display either. Deb planted both hands on the table, her tone tight. "Part of it, Claire. This man isn't just some entrepreneur. He's tied to people in the underground, the kind of people the press doesn't name out loud. You're close to someone dangerous." My fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "Deb, I know who he is. I'm not blind, but I've never felt safer than I do when I'm with him." She held my gaze for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "Feeling safe and being safe are not the same thing. Men like Jack don't live by the rules we do. Today he might protect you, but if you ever become a liability, he could walk away without looking back." I knew she wasn't saying it to scare me. Deb had seen me crumble during those final months with Mark. She had been there when I broke down, crying over wounds that weren't always visible. She didn't want to watch me fall into another spiral, no matter how glamorous this one looked from the outside. But I couldn't step back anymore. I met her eyes. Steady. "I know this isn't what I imagined life would look like after the divorce, but Jack is different. He doesn't lie to me. He doesn't manipulate me. He doesn't make me feel small. And most of all, he makes me feel seen, understood." Deb was quiet for a long moment before her tone softened. "Maybe you're right. Maybe he does care about you. But, Claire, please don't let your heart silence your reason. If there ever comes a day when he changes, You have to be clear-headed enough to walk away. Don't wait until it's too late. I nodded, though the weight in my chest said otherwise. I couldn't promise her that. Not because I was weak, but because I had already crossed too far past the line of safety. And every time Jack looked at me as if I was the only thing tethering him to the last human part of himself, I knew I couldn't turn away. After that conversation, I didn't bring Jack up to Deb again. But something inside me began to split. I trusted Jack, and I trusted Deb. One was the truth that made me feel alive. The other was the reality reminding me not to lose myself. And I knew, sooner or later, I would have to choose between them. I had just left the clinic and was about to cross into the parking lot when I saw a familiar figure standing half-hidden beside the lamppost at the end of the walkway. The collar of his coat was pulled up high, a hood drawn over his head, shadowing most of his face, but I recognized him instantly. Mark. He didn't look like the man I remembered. The arrogance was gone. His face was pale, unshaven, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, as though he hadn't slept in days. When I stopped, his gaze flickered up to meet mine, before dropping to the ground again. "Claire, please," he said, his voice rough and trembling. I stayed where I was, hand tightening around the strap of my bag, unsure if what I felt was anger or curiosity. "Do you still have something to say to me?" He took a shaky breath, pulling a crumpled stack of papers from his coat pocket. "This is a debt release form. I've already signed it. All you have to do is sign your part, and I'll have no more claim to the remaining money from the house sale." I stared at him, suspicious. Why now? He swallowed hard, glancing around as though afraid someone might be watching. I knew that look. It wasn't worry, it was fear. "Claire," his voice cracked. "Someone came to see me. A man, tall, quiet." He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, but he said a few things that made it hard to breathe. He knows where I live, what I've been doing, the debts I've been hiding. My pulse slowed to a cold, steady beat. I didn't ask who. I didn't have to. "Jack." Mark looked up at me for the first time. "Claire, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. That man, he's not like anyone I've ever met." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. But when he left, I felt like I'd just escaped a slow death. "Please, sign the paper. End it. I don't want the money anymore. I just want this over." I took the papers silently, eyes tracing his signature at the bottom of the page. His hand was trembling. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, even in the crisp autumn air of Chicago. And for the first time in all the years I had known him, I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I didn't need to raise my voice. Didn't need to prove anything. The quiet existence of another man had already made Mark crumble like grass under a cold wind. I pulled a pen from my bag and signed my name in one clean stroke. When I handed the document back, Mark's eyes glistened not with emotion, but with defeat. "Thank you," he muttered, before turning away. No handshake, no goodbye, just the sound of his footsteps fading among the cars until he disappeared. Like a ghost finally released, I stood there for a while, watching where he had been. The wind lifted my hair, but I didn't feel cold. Something stirred deep in my chest, a strange blend of relief and heaviness. Jack had done what I once believed no one could do. He made Mark afraid, not through violence, but through something far greater, the silent power of a man who never needed to prove his strength. And yet, beneath the safety he gave me, a different feeling began to take root. I knew Jack had done it for me, but what was the cost of that protection? A part of me began to wonder if he could make Mark collapse in a matter of minutes. What could he do to anyone else? What could he do to me? If one day I stepped outside the circle of his protection, I walked out of the parking lot with the signed paper in hand, leaving Mark behind in memory. But inside me, something small and uneasy had begun to grow a quiet seed of doubt. And I knew, from that moment on, I would live between two worlds, the freedom I had always longed for, and the ever-lengthening shadow of the man I was beginning to love. Monday morning, I handed the signed debt release to my lawyer. The document felt heavier than its few sheets of paper deserved, like the closing weight of a long chapter I'd once believed would never end. The woman behind the oak desk studied each page, each signature, then looked up with a small, professional smile. "Congratulations, Miss Dixix. Claire. From this point on, Mark Bennett no longer has any claim to your assets. All obligations between you are legally terminated." I nodded, thanked her, and walked out of the office with a strange kind of stillness inside me. Not relief exactly, something quieter. It was like stepping out of a box I'd lived in for so long that I'd forgotten how bright the world outside could be. I drove straight to the bank where Mark had kept the temporary post-divorce account. A portion of the house sale money had been frozen there, delayed by excuses, withheld by technicalities. One of his last means of control. With the original document in hand, the process went smoother than I dared hope. The account manager verified my name, compared the signatures, and after a brief pause, nodded. The transfer would be completed to my personal account by the end of the day. When the confirmation alert came through, I stood motionless for a moment in front of the bank's glass doors. Everything I had fought for, every tear, every sleepless night was now reduced to a string of numbers glowing on a phone screen. I thought I'd scream, or cry, or open a bottle of wine and toast to freedom. But instead, there was only silence, an unfamiliar peace. Still and complete, like air after a storm. At home, I put on a soft record, brewed tea, and sat in the worn leather chair by the window, the same place I used to curl up after the divorce, arms around my knees, staring into the dark. Only this time, I didn't need the armor of loneliness. Mark was gone. No more demands. No more control. No more midnight threats in my inbox. I had won, but it wasn't the kind of victory that made you cheer. It was liberation. And liberation, I realized, always comes with a cost. I reached for my phone, scrolling through messages until I stopped at the last one from Jack. His words from days earlier stared back at me. "I won't push. But I'm still here." I typed slowly. "It's done. I've officially closed the past." A minute later, 3 dots appeared. Then his reply. "Good. Now you can start living for real. No promises. No comfort. Just truth." And yet, I felt his presence beside me as clearly as if he were sitting in that chair across the room. That night, I stepped onto the balcony. The city stretched below rows of quiet houses, bathed in golden streetlight. Autumn wind whispering through the trees. I wondered if I'd stepped too far from safety. If loving a man like Jack, a man who could make Mark collapse with a single glance, was reckless or inevitable. But then I remembered all the years I'd lived in fear. All the times I'd let love be traded for control. Now, every thread tying me to Mark was severed. I was free. And if love could only exist where freedom did, then maybe this was my first chance to love without fear, even if it meant walking into the gray world Jack inhabited, where rules blurred and truth lived between shadows. It might be dangerous. It might demand everything. But for the first time in my life, I felt strong enough to take responsibility for my own choice. And this time, I chose to live, not just to survive. A week after everything with Mark was finally settled, I got an unexpected call from Jack. Not a cryptic text. Not one of our usual late-night invitations wrapped in silence. A call on a Saturday morning while I was still in the kitchen pouring coffee. His voice was low, calm, but there was something in it I hadn't heard before. Hesitation. Jack never hesitated. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said. "Just lunch. Nothing formal." I paused, heartbeat skipping once. "Your sister." "Right." A quiet laugh hummed through the line, the kind that felt like a hand resting on my shoulder. "Yes, Lily. We don't usually bring people into our circle. But I think you should meet her. She's the only family I have left." I didn't need to think twice. "All right," I said, "but I'm warning you, I'm dressing up. Don't be surprised." The house was in Evanston, tucked inside a quiet neighborhood not far from Chicago. The front yard was filled with white daisies and dahlias, the kind of home you'd expect in an old family movie, the windows framed with white curtains. the faint promise of warm pie always in the air. Jack didn't drive me there. He let me come on my own. Maybe to keep it from feeling like an introduction with expectations. When I pulled up and stepped out, Lily was already waiting on the porch. She was around my age, her brown hair loosely tied back, her eyes carrying the same shade of gray as Jack's, but gentler, softer. Her smile met me halfway, effortless and kind. "Claire," she said warmly, "I've heard so much about you. I didn't think my brother was capable of caring this much about anyone." I laughed, took her hand, and followed her inside. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and toasted bread, like stepping into a memory you didn't know you had. Lily showed me around the house, small but bright. Lived in. Walls lined with old family photos. One caught my eye, a boy with messy dark hair, eyes full of light, holding a wooden knife like a toy sword. "I can't believe that turned into him," I teased. Jack appeared from the kitchen just then, in a simple shirt with the sleeves rolled up, 2 glasses of water in his hands. "You'd be surprised," he said with a hint of a smile. Lunch was simple but beautiful creamy mushroom soup, garlic buttered toast, a fresh vegetable salad, and a warm apple pie resting in the center of the table. No one mentioned his work. No one brought up Mark. There were no shadows from the world outside, only laughter. Lily told stories about how Jack once climbed onto the roof to hide from their mother, how she dyed her hair green in high school and cried for a week when the color turned out wrong, how they learned to care for each other after their parents died in a car accident. I didn't realize how many times I laughed that afternoon. I just knew that, for the first time in what felt like forever, I could eat without the tightness in my chest. When Lily refilled my cup of tea, she looked at me quietly. "I know my brother isn't easy to understand," she said, "but if you're the reason he breathes easier these days, I hope you'll stay." I looked up and Jack was already watching me. He didn't speak, but in his eyes there was a release, as if something inside him had finally unclenched. When it was time to leave, Lily hugged me lightly and whispered, "Don't let him close himself off again. You're the first one who's managed to reach him." Driving home, I didn't turn on the radio. The car filled with a soft kind of silence, the good kind. My hand rested loosely on the wheel, my thoughts drifting somewhere between the past and whatever this was becoming. It wasn't love in the way I'd once understood it. It wasn't about titles, or promises, or the safety of knowing what came next. It was belonging, just sitting at a warm table, hearing the childhood stories of the man I was learning to love, watching him shed the armor he wore for the world and become simply a brother. A man while a woman learning to trust again. I began to believe in something I thought I'd lost forever. A family. One afternoon in early November, when the leaves had begun to fall more thickly along the roads that curved around Lake Michigan, Jack and I sat together in a small cafe by the water, a place we'd come to make our own over quiet weekends. The cafe had large windows facing the lake, pala wooden tables, and wicker chairs that creaked softly whenever you moved. Jack set his cup down and looked at me for a long time without speaking. He never needed many words, but that look carried something deliberate and real, as if he were turning a thought over carefully in his hands before letting it go. "Claire," he said finally, his voice steady, "I think it's time we found a place of our own." I froze for a breath, not out of surprise, but because my heart seemed to skip and then settle into a slower rhythm. The sentence was simple, without ornament or promise, but it carried the weight of quiet commitment. I reached across the table and rested my hand on his prusset. "I think so too," I said. "My apartment doesn't feel like home anymore, and your house, beautiful as it is, it still breathes too much of the past." Jack nodded, the faintest smile in his eyes. He understood without needing to explain. We started looking not long after that. Not for the grand houses he'd once lived in, nor the high-rise apartments sealed off from the city's pulse, but for something smaller, a house with a little yard, close enough to see the skyline when we wanted, far enough to hear birds in the morning, every weekend. After my hospital shifts and his quiet phone calls that always seemed to end in unfinished sentences, we would drive to another listing. Some days it rained, and Jack would hold the umbrella over me, careful and precise as always, making sure my shoes didn't touch the wet stone path. Other days, the first snow had started to fall, and we'd stand in a yard gone white, imagining a swing chair under the maple and lavender lining the fence. Once, while viewing a small 2-story house in Oak Park, I stepped into the living room with its dark wooden floor, low ceiling, and a wide window overlooking the garden. I turned to him. "This is where I can picture myself reading every Sunday night," I said, "while you're in the kitchen cooking dinner." He came to stand behind me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "I can picture it even clearer," he murmured. "There's an old cat asleep at your feet, and you're wearing reading glasses." I laughed, swatting at his arm, but my chest warmed with something deeper than amusement. For the first time in years, I could see not just a house but myself in it, and that image didn't feel lonely. Then, one early winter morning, we found it, a pale gray house with a white porch and 3 shallow steps leading to the front door. The maple tree out front was almost bare, its branches skeletal against the sky, but the trunk stood strong and alive. Inside, everything was simple: an open kitchen, an old-fashioned fireplace, and a bedroom on the ground floor with a window that looked out onto the back garden. Jack met my eyes, and I didn't have to nod. We both knew. This was it, the beginning of another chapter. Not a refuge, not a hiding place, a home meant to be lived in. That night, after he'd poured 2 glasses of wine, we sat on the bare wooden floor, backs against the wall, surrounded by emptiness that somehow felt complete. I looked around the room and smiled. "I think I finally understand what home feels like," I said softly. He lifted his glass, touching it lightly to mine. "To a home that doesn't have to be big," he said. "Just one where you have the right person to face the winter with." And I smiled back because for the first time in my life, I knew I had chosen right. The first days in our new home felt like drifting through a dream, soft, disordered, and tender in the way winter seeps into the city. It doesn't arrive all at once, just lingers at the edge of the air, enough to make 2 people want to hold each other a little closer when night falls. Jack and I learned the rhythms of the house in our own ways. He always woke before me, the one to brew the first cup of coffee, while I liked to wander the small backyard wrapped in my thick robe, checking whether the potted herbs had survived the night's chill. Some mornings we had breakfast together, quietly reading the paper or listening to the news. Other mornings, I'd find him gone before sunrise, leaving behind a small handwritten note beside toast: "Still warm, sleep a little more. It's cold out, and I couldn't bring myself to wake you." I began to notice Jack's small habits, the kind that revealed a past more disciplined than he ever admitted. He folded clothes with almost military precision. His desk always neat, though his drawers were full of coded documents I never asked about. He never used an alarm clock. His body kept perfect time. I, on the other hand, was messy in a gentle sort of way. Books scattered everywhere, jackets draped over chairs, lights left on after I'd already climbed into bed. The first time Jack reminded me to turn them off, I smiled and said, "If you live with me, you'll have to learn to live with a little bit of charming chaos." He didn't laugh, just walked over, switched off the lights, and pressed a kiss to my forehead. But not every day was gentle. The first time we fought was over a document I shouldn't have read. Jack had left it on his desk, half buried under other papers. It wasn't a business file, at least. Not the kind you'd show to a bank. It listed transactions I didn't understand, and something in my gut told me they weren't clean. When I asked, keeping my voice steady, Jack was silent for a long while before saying quietly, "You have the right to know, but also the right not to. The truth doesn't always make you lighter." I was angry, not because he kept secrets, but because I suddenly realized there were rooms in his world I would never be invited into. That night, I skipped dinner and went to bed early, curling up under the blanket, trying not to think. Sometime past midnight, I felt the mattress dip beside me. Jack didn't speak. He just took my hand and held it, his palm large and warm, his fingers weaving through mine. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here," and I understood. Loving someone like Jack meant accepting there would always be shadows I couldn't enter, but that didn't mean he was shutting me out. We learned to meet halfway, like people building something fragile, but real. He learned not to control everything. I learned not to demand to know it all. Every evening, after dinner, we had a small ritual clearing the table, washing dishes together, and brewing 2 mugs of herbal tea. Jack didn't even like tea, but he drank it because I did. I always added a slice of lemon to his cup. The one thing he said helped him sleep. Those evenings were never grand. We'd sit side by side, sometimes talking about our day or the neighbor's dog, sometimes saying nothing at all, just letting the music fill the quiet. But in those ordinary hours, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, that I was alive, seen, chosen, and loved in the quiet way that lasts. Once, I asked him, "Do you ever regret choosing this me with all my clutter and moods and endless questions?" Jack smiled, drew me close, and whispered, "I've never felt this much peace." And I believed him. We didn't need forever carved into promises. We just needed the days that were real, the ones where 2 imperfect people learned how to live for each other. Honestly, simply, and completely. A year after Jack and I moved in together, on a cold December evening, when the wind began to slip through the cracks of our windows and holiday lights glimmered faintly in shop fronts, he asked if I would go out to dinner with him. He didn't say where, only that I should dress nicely, the way he always did when something special was brewing behind his calm exterior. I put on the wine-colored velvet dress he once said made me look like autumn stitched onto silk, slipped into my gray wool coat, and left my hair down, just as he liked. He came to pick me up in our old car, not the black SUV I'd always hated, and opened the door for me with that quiet warmth that spoke louder than words. We didn't talk much as we drove. Jazz hummed low from the radio, and his hand rested loosely over mine on the gear shift. A silent pulse of connection. When the car turned down an old familiar street, I recognized it immediately, the cracked sidewalk, the faint neon sign of that bar. I turned to him, startled. "I thought you never wanted me to come back here." His eyes stayed on the road, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Because this is where everything began," he said softly. "And if there's something important to say, it should be said right where it all started." I stepped into the bar slowly. It looked almost exactly the same as it had more than a year ago. Dim green lights, clinking glasses, the faint smell of cheap cocktails, and old speakers crackling with half-forgotten tunes. But something was different this time. I wasn't walking in alone. Jack was beside me, his hand at the small of my back steady, certain, a quiet anchor in the noise. Our table was in the far corner, the same spot where I'd once sat shattered and small, clutching a drink that didn't taste of anything but survival. But now there were already 2 glasses of red wine waiting for us, a small plate of tapas between them, as if someone had known exactly how the night would unfold. Jack didn't speak right away. He just looked at me, his gaze stripped of mystery. Full, instead of something calm and grounded, the kind of peace that only comes to men who have stopped pretending they don't need love. "Claire," he began quietly, "I used to think I was someone who didn't get happy endings. I've lived in the gray where there's no room for dreams or peace. But then you came along, with your softness, your mess, your fears, and you turned my life into something worth calling a life." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, dark blue velvet box, setting it gently on the table before opening it. Inside was a simple ring, white gold. No diamonds. Just a single small sapphire, the same shade as his eyes. "Would you let this place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the place that once held your pain, become the beginning of your happiest memory?" I couldn't speak. Tears welled up and spilled over before I could stop them, not out of shock, but because I had never felt so full. I nodded, wordlessly, and he slid the ring onto my finger with the hands I knew would never let go. People around us began to notice. A few soft claps, a couple of smiles. No noisy, no spectacle, just 2 people finding each other again in a place that had once broken them. When we stepped back into the night, I held his hand tightly. The wind was cold, but my heart was impossibly warm. I turned once to look at the bar's closed door, the same one I had walked out of alone a year before, carrying nothing but loneliness. Now, I wasn't just walking beside a man. I was walking with a promise, one that didn't need to be spoken to be real. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the future anymore, because wherever it would lead us, I knew I would never walk it alone. I sat on the porch that Sunday morning, cradling a warm cup of coffee between my palms, my breath mingling with the thin veil of late autumn mist. The last few leaves drifted slowly down across the lawn, and each faint gust of wind made the branches tremble, whispering farewells from a season that was fading. Inside, I could hear Jack moving about the kitchen, the soft hum of music, the steady rhythm of running water. It was an ordinary morning, simple and unremarkable. Yet my heart felt impossibly full, as if I had just stepped out of a dream that had found its perfect ending. I glanced down at my left hand, where the ring he had given me only a few weeks earlier still caught the pale morning light. Never, in all the tangled turns of my life, had I imagined an ending like this. I had never believed that a journey beginning in such loneliness could lead to a love so deep, so complete. A year ago, I had sat alone in a dim old bar, clutching a watery cocktail as if holding on to the last fragile trace of myself. After the divorce, I'd been unmoored, not because I still loved Mark, but because I had let that relationship strip away pieces of me I didn't know I'd lost. My self-worth, my voice, the quiet pride of simply being enough. I'd convinced myself I was someone's leftover replaceable, forgettable, and then Jack appeared. Not with grand gestures or rehearsed words, but with a calm presence that unsettled and comforted me all at once. He didn't save me. He never tried to. But through his steady patience, he reminded me of the woman I used to be, the one who smiled easily, who dreamed, who once walked into rooms with her head held high. Jack's love was never loud. It was in the small, deliberate things, the way he listened, the way he stood beside me when I needed to face what I feared most. When Mark resurfaced, when old threats tried to drag me back into that familiar darkness, Jack didn't fight my battles for me. He simply reminded me that I had a choice, not between two men, but between respecting myself or continuing to live in the shadow of what had broken me. And I chose, piece by piece. I reclaimed my life, my freedom, my voice, my finances, my dignity. But I knew I had truly stepped out of the darkness the moment I began to dream again. Not abstract dreams, but vivid ones. A home with warm light in the windows. Mornings that smelled of coffee. Dinners laced with laughter. Winters where another hand reached for mine under the table. Life with Jack wasn't perfect. We disagreed. We fell silent sometimes. There were scars from the past that would never fade. But every time I turned away, he was still there in his quiet, unshakable way, proving that love wasn't meant to confine, but to allow you to become more of yourself. I thought of Lily, his sister, and how she'd looked at me with that knowing warmth the first time we met. He needs someone who can keep the human part of him from disappearing into the dark, she'd said with her eyes, not her words. I thought of our quiet nights sitting on the wooden floor together, saying nothing but feeling everything. I thought of the little gray house we chose, not because it was grand, but because it felt like a beginning built on truth rather than haste. It had been a long road from a woman newly divorced and lost among the wreckage of her old life, to one who had learned to love and be loved again, not for perfection, but for courage, for choosing to keep walking when the path was uncertain. I set my cup down and rose. Stepping back into the house, Jack looked up from the sink, and his eyes calm, deep, and steady were the same as the day I first met him. I smiled, walked up behind him, and wrapped my arms around his waist. In that moment, I knew that every wound, every loss, every lonely night had brought me here to this quiet certainty, not to a perfect destination, but to a safe harbor strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. And more than anything, I knew this, I would never have to walk alone again. On a still Sunday afternoon, as the late autumn sunlight slanted through the window and cast a thin golden glow across the warm wooden floor, Jack walked toward me in the living room with a soft smile. His hand extended in quiet invitation. There was no music playing. No background melody. Only the familiar sounds of the house that had long become a part of our lives. "Do you remember our first dance?" "Claire," he asked. I smiled, placing my hand in his. How could I forget? When that dance changed, everything Jack's hand rested gently on my back, and we began to move slowly, deliberately, as if the whole world had paused just to let us relive the moment our love first began. The room seemed to turn with his steps, but my heart stayed still and steady, beating peacefully in a world that once had felt far too chaotic. I had once been the woman sitting alone in a bar, wondering if I was still someone worth loving. I had lived in doubt, in fear, surrounded by the shadows of a past that refused to heal. But then, a single dance, a look, a hand reaching for mine, reminded me that I was still worthy of tenderness, of being seen, of being loved completely. Jack didn't come into my life to rescue me. He came to show me that I could love myself again. Our love has never been perfect, but it has always been honest. Neither of us tried to be the hero. We were simply two people, both scarred, learning how to mend the broken pieces of our souls together. A dance that began as a way to stand tall in front of the ghosts of the past somehow became the first step toward true happiness. It was the kind of miracle you never see coming. Maybe that's how it works for everyone. Each of us has our own fated dance. Some find it easily. Others have to lose themselves before they can be found. But what matters most is the courage to step out of the darkness, to reach for the hand that's offered, even if you don't know where it will lead. Because, as I've learned, sometimes one small moment is enough to change everything. My story may have begun in pain, but it ends in healing, and I believe each of us deserves an ending like that. Thank you for following my journey with Jack in today's story. Did it remind you of something from your own life? Have you ever found yourself standing at a crossroads between a painful past and an uncertain future? I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, because every heart carries a story worth being heard and understood. Don't forget to subscribe to Underworld Love Stories and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next tale. If this story touched you, please like and share it to help spread a little more hope and warmth to those who need it. Thank you for spending your time here. I wish you good health, peace in your days, and a life filled with joy and love. Until next time, goodbye, and see you in the next video.